The orbital city of Luma Arc rose like a glittering crown above the blue planet below. Its polished towers shone under the steady glow of solar mirrors, and its sky lanes hummed with silent craft that glided between docking gates. Inside this floating city lived people of every rank, but none carried themselves with as much loud pride as the magnate named Roland. He owned half the trade routes of the Eastern Quadrant and walked through the halls of his estate with a confidence that made even his guests step aside. Every week he hosted gatherings where the influential met to congratulate one another. The gatherings always took place in his grand hall, a room lined with crystal sheets and illuminated by shifting auroras, woven by drones. In that same estate worked a quiet maid named Lena. She had been hired 2 years earlier and was known for her steady hands, her quiet voice, and her remarkable discipline. Many guests barely noticed her as she moved around the gatherings preparing trays, adjusting lights, and keeping the hall in flawless order. Roland noticed her only when something did not meet his standards. Even then he spoke to her without looking at her face. He walked past her as if she were another piece of furniture waiting to be relocated. Lena did not mind the harshness. She had grown up in the lower districts of Luma Arc, where life was shaped by cramped corridors and strict rules. Her dream of music had seemed distant back then. The only piano she had touched was a discarded one left in a storage bay. The keys were discolored, one pedal stuck, but she had learned to coax life from it in stolen hours while other children slept. Her fingers carried memories of those quiet moments even now. There was a reason she stayed in Roland's estate. In the far corner of the grand hall stood a polished gravity piano. It was shaped from alloy glass and used magnetic field strings instead of traditional wires. It could produce tones that shimmered in the air and resonated through the floor. She cleaned it every week, always with reverence. Every time she touched it, she felt the weight of a dream she was not allowed to chase. The staff manual forbade workers from using guest instruments. She had obeyed without complaint. On the night, everything changed. The grand hall buzzed with guests arriving from the central hub. Representatives from outer stations had come to discuss new trade rights, and Roland planned to impress them. Soft lights floated over the tables and servers moved through the hall, carrying glass, plates filled with luminous fruit and spice vapors. The air hummed with faint music projected from sound nodes hidden in the ceiling. Roland stood near the gravity piano, speaking loudly to a group of merchants. Lena worked near the entrance, arranging a tray of crystalline flutes while listening to the conversations drifting around the hall. She heard Roland boasting about the price he paid for the piano. He described it in technical detail without once speaking of music itself. The merchants nodded politely. Then a guest from the frontier station approached the piano and tapped one of the keys. A faint tone shimmered. The guest laughed and asked whether Roland played. Roland dismissed the idea with a wave and said he had no time for childish hobbies. The guest then asked if anyone in his household played. Roland looked over at his staff and scoffed. He pointed at Lina and said she once mentioned that she liked music. His tone made the admission sound like a flaw. The merchants laughed, and Roland added that anyone from the lower districts claimed to have talent. His voice carried across the hall, and several people turned. Lena felt heat gathering in her chest, but she kept her face calm. She placed the tray on the table and prepared to step away. The guest seemed curious rather than mocking. He asked if the maid truly played. Roland dismissed the question with more laughter. He said someone like her could hardly understand the complexity of a gravity piano. The laughter around him grew louder. Lena felt the sting of embarrassment, but she bowed slightly and tried to leave. The frontier guest stopped her with a raised hand. He apologized for the remarks made about her and said he would be honored to hear even one note. Roland looked irritated, but his pride pushed him to allow the moment. He said she could try if she wished, but warned the guests not to expect anything pleasant. His voice cut like a blade. Lena hesitated. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had never touched the piano, though she had dreamed of it each night. She was aware of every eye in the hall. If she refused, Roland would use her refusal to mock her further. If she tried and failed, the humiliation would linger. She had lived with moments like this in the lower districts and knew that fear only grew if she bowed to it. She walked toward the piano. The hall fell silent. Gravity fields around the instrument shifted in response to her presence. The transparent keys reflected the glimmer of lights above. She positioned her hands above the keyboard. Her breath trembled. She closed her eyes. In her mind, she summoned the memory of the old storage, bay piano, and the countless hours spent coaxing sound from its tired frame. She remembered how the music had helped her survive nights full of uncertainty. Her fingers were steady now. The first note rang through the hall. It rose pure and strong. The gravity strings responded to her touch with a resonance she had only imagined. She let the next note follow, and then another, until a melody shaped itself under her hands. It was a tune she had created in the lower districts, one that carried hope and quiet strength. The notes swelled through the hall. Guests who had been chatting moments earlier stood frozen. The shimmering tones lifted their heads. Roland stared in disbelief. He had expected clumsy pounding, not a melody that breathed with life. The hall filled with layers of sound as Lena added harmonies that shifted like flowing light. The air vibrated with warm energy. Several guests stepped closer. Some felt their eyes sting with emotion they had not expected to feel in such a lavish hall. Lena lost herself in the music. For the first time in years, she felt the boundaries of fear break apart. She played not for praise, but for the simple truth that her spirit had survived hardship and deserved to be heard. Her hands moved with certainty. The melody rose higher. The hall seemed to expand. Even the drones that maintained the lights slowed as, if caught in the music's pull, when the final note faded, the silence felt endless. The hall remained still. Lena lowered her hands and stepped back. She bowed politely and turned to leave. She expected Roland to dismiss her. Instead, the frontier guest began to applaud. His hands struck together with respect. Others joined. Soon the entire hall resounded with applause. People who had never spoken to her called out words of admiration. Roland's face tightened. He had always controlled the atmosphere of his gatherings. Now the attention had shifted away from him and towards someone he considered unimportant. He forced a smile and pretended he had always believed she could play. The frontier guest ignored Roland and approached Lena. He asked where she had trained. She replied gently that she had learned alone. That answer stunned him. He spoke with excitement about musicians needed in frontier academies. He said her talent could move crowds even in distant colonies where morale often faltered. He offered to sponsor an audition. The hall echoed with supportive murmurs. Roland intervened and attempted to claim that she was needed in his estate. Lena stood still without responding. The frontier guest asked whether she wished to remain. Lena looked around the hall she had polished for years. The lights shimmered across the tables. She felt no anger, only clarity. She thanked Roland for the work he had given her, but explained that music had always been her true path. Roland wanted to protest, but the eyes of his influential guests held him in place that the offer from the frontier guest was genuine. Lena accepted. The hall applauded again. Roland forced himself to stand quietly, though his pride stung. His gatherings had never been remembered for anything except business dealings. Now this night would be remembered for something he had mocked. Lena left the estate 2 days later. A small shuttle carried her through the sky lanes to the central hub. She looked out at the towers of Luma Arc and felt her past settle behind her. The frontier guest met her at the hub and escorted her to a long-range cruiser that would take her to the outer systems. Musicians and engineers greeted her with warm curiosity. During the voyage, the ship's crew encouraged her to play in the common hall. The gravity piano on board was older than the one in Roland's estate, but still elegant. When she played, the crew gathered around her in quiet appreciation. They told her that music held even greater meaning in the frontier, where isolation weighed heavily on settlers. Her melodies brought comfort to people who spent months between stars. When the ship reached the frontier station, Lena was escorted to the academy. The instructors listened to her play and approved her admission without hesitation. They said her instinctive ability to shape emotion through tone was rare. She trained under masters who had performed across many worlds. They taught her to use gravity fields in complex ways, creating harmonics that resonated across large chambers. Years passed. Lena became known throughout the frontier for her performances. Settlers traveled long distances to hear her. Soldiers leaving for distant patrols carried recordings of her music for strength during lonely nights. Colonies spoke of her ability to lift spirits with a single melody. Her name became a symbol of the quiet power humans could wield even in the vastness of space. Meanwhile, Roland's fame on Luma Arc began to wane. His gatherings felt empty. Guests whispered about the night the maid he had mocked had risen above him. They said his pride had blinded him. Roland tried to reclaim his reputation, but found that people no longer listened with the same respect. One day a broadcast arrived on every channel in Luma Arc. It announced that Lena would perform in the planetary capital for a major unity celebration. The event would gather leaders from dozens of colonies. Roland watched the broadcast in disbelief. He had once dismissed her as insignificant. Now her name appeared on banners across the system. The celebration day arrived. People from many worlds filled the grand amphitheater of the capital. The stage held a massive gravity piano surrounded by projection screens that displayed shifting lights. When Lena stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted with cheers. She bowed calmly. The lights dimmed. Silence filled the amphitheater. Lena closed her eyes and began to play. Her melody flowed like a river of starlight. The tones carried stories of forgotten districts, distant colonies, and the strength that lived quietly in human hearts. The projection screens displayed patterns that moved with the music. The crowd sat spellbound. Some cried. Some felt a renewed sense of purpose. The melody rose and fell with gentle certainty. When it ended, the applause shook the entire amphitheater. The broadcast reached every orbiting city, including Luma Arc. Roland watched as the crowd stood in admiration for the maid he had ridiculed. For the first time he understood the weight of his arrogance. He realized that talent could rise from any corner of human society. His pride had nearly crushed a gift that uplifted thousands. Lena looked out at the crowd and felt gratitude. She knew her journey had been shaped by hardship, but the music that had carried her through the darkness now reached countless others. She stood tall. Humans across the frontier spoke of the performance for years. They admired how someone from humble origins touched hearts throughout the stars. Her story traveled farther than she ever dreamed. It reminded people that humanity's strength did not lie in wealth or status, but in the quiet talents that emerged from unexpected places. Lena's music became a symbol of unity in a growing sea of worlds. She continued to perform across colonies, bringing hope to distant settlements. And whenever she played a certain familiar melody, she remembered the day she gathered her courage in a hall filled with doubtful eyes. She remembered how she had trusted her own spirit. She remembered how one moment of music had silenced a room and revealed the truth that had lived in her heart all along. In every world, she visited people, repeated the same message. Humanity rises not because of the powerful, but because of those who dare to share their gifts, even when the world tries to silence them. Lena continued her journey, carrying that message in every note she played,